Yes, thank you for sticking with us for so long and for listening actually to the final speech of this evening. I think I will not, the scope of, or the idea of my speech is not so much to give you more cases from, let's say, you know, something that happened in the US or something that happened in Europe or somewhere else, but actually to have a very practical approach on the daily problems or the daily questions that if you are investing in well, basically internationally, but mostly also in Eastern European countries, that you're facing. To give you an idea of our company, you all know Henkel and you all know Bayer. That's quite easy, so they don't need to introduce themselves. But HHLA, which we like as our abbreviation of our company, is based in the city of Hamburg, and we have basically revenues of about 1 billion euros, and we transport quite a few containers throughout Central and Eastern Europe. We have about 5,000 employees. I will not bore you with the history, but we're quite old, as you can see. We have different, but I guess this is also interesting in terms of our exposure to international sanctions and what we have to worry about actually as a company doing international transports. And that is that we have, we have 4 different segments, and as you can see, except the real estate one, which is mainly based in Hamburg, we're doing logistics, intermodal, which is container train transport, and then of course container handling and seaports. All of these are basically, of course, possibly exposed to international sanctions. As you can see here in this slide, we do all sorts of transports throughout Eastern Europe. We have a container terminal in Odessa, actually, operating there. So yes, we need to take care of all, or basically have a look at all the possible sanctions that our business partners could be faced with. So let's basically start with the general obstacles that we're facing as an investor. Basically, there's a discrepancy, and you're basically, as an investor, you're caught in the middle here. Because on the one hand, you have the fines, penalties, and the economic sanctions if you violate the sanctions themselves. And if you stick, if you do stick with your business partners, and if you don't, then you're, on the other hand, you're facing civil and local consequences like cancellations, resignations, compensations, and then of course also the relations to the country and the government where your investment is either planned or already placed. This is also something when people are starting to get the telephone and to talk to you and saying what are we going to do in this situation. How to possibly approach this? I'm mainly focusing on 2 things, actually just one, but because the one my colleague here already mentioned, which are the general compliance measures that you can take within your company, which are business partner screenings, software screenings against sanction lists, like TNT is doing as well. And I can tell you, I'm a strong supporter of these lists, because sometimes, of course, you say, you know, software is boring and it costs a lot of money, and usually the outcome may not even be very good. You have these very high sophisticated systems, but in the end there's nothing coming out. But it is actually, let me tell you from the practical experience, that it's important to have them, especially because the situation changes sometimes quite often. Sometimes there's companies who are on a sanction list, and then of course you need to take that into consideration. If for example, if a ship from a shipping company which is on the sanction list is coming to the port of Hamburg, and right at that moment they're on the sanction list, then of course you're not allowed to handle their cargo and to do business with them. But then we had to learn that, of course, these companies have a strong interest to get off the list, and some do succeed. And then there were times when, for example, this company is off the list, and then you're allowed to handle them again. but then all of a sudden they're back on the list, or they're on another list. They may be on the, not anymore on the US list, but now they're on the European list. You have to, and this is something where only the software can really help you to give you daily updated information on what you have to observe and whom you really have to have a look at. And then, of course, yes, there's the basic business partner screenings, of course, where especially in terms of high-risk countries, of course, you can do your checks internally. Another thing, of course, is that when you start thinking about investments, or start actually even just entering into normal contracts, normal service contracts for exchange of goods or whatever, in countries that might be affected by sanctions, you need to think about appropriate contractual arrangements in order to secure your investment or your business somehow. Of course, they're not 100% guarantee that nothing will happen in the future, but at least they should be considered, and you should make sure that you have this kind of these kind of provisions in your agreements. Basically, I want to focus on four main types of clauses here that you should consider. One is the choice of law, then force majeure clauses, contract adjustment clauses, and then purpose definitions within an agreement. Let's look at them, each of them for a moment. First of all, you definitely have to be careful with the choice of law that you're choosing. Of course, this is a general question that you're facing. Is not only with respect to sanctions. Every lawyer knows that it's something that you have to consider, to make sure you're not exposing yourself to laws that you're insecure about. But with respect to sanctions, it is even more important because if you run into the situation that you've chosen the law of a country which is all of a sudden sanctioned or affected by sanctions, then it may be, then if you've, the example here is that, of course, if you've entered into an agreement which is governed by the laws of Iran, then the Iranian courts will look, of course, when it comes to looking into the agreement and the rights and duties of the parties, then they will say, well, wait a minute, under the laws of Iran, U.S. sanctions are null and void. We don't care about them, and they're not an effective part of the Iranian legal system. So for us, they don't exist. And then, of course, you have a problem. So you better define your rules of arbitration, choice of law, and internationally accepted places and courts of arbitration. Doctrine of frustration and contract adjustment clause is another thing to where you can basically secure your own interests, is that you define the conditions which enable you to adjust a contract. Especially, of course, this is good if you're in a business where you're trading, for example, with all kinds of products, and then you can insert a clause which rules that if in case of sanctions imposed on one product, the agreement shall still be applicable for the other products, but not for this product any longer. That's a rather easy way of covering this part. The next one, or the last one actually, are purpose definitions. That's once again another thing that makes it easier later on to interpret what the parties actually intended. There it's just once again necessary to describe the purpose of what the goods are supposed to be used for, and also in order to prevent sanctions, of course, with respect to dual-use goods, you need to make sure that you're not catching one of those, because then I think it doesn't make much sense to describe that you're going to use them for another purpose. If they're on the list, they're on the list, and then they're hard to handle. Now, when you're looking into investments from the investor side, you're facing all kinds of different institutes which are also subject to sanctions or to sanctions regulations. There's first of all the financing banks. Then there's insurance and reinsurance and investment guarantors. And then there's, of course, the investor yourself with all your directors, officers, employees, the seller, and the target company. And if you have, if you're entering into a partnership, then of course the partner also has to look at his own position. If you're investing with a local partner, for example, then the local partner also has to consider his own sanction problems with financing, insurance, etc. Now, as mentioned earlier, we have, of course, the big package of OFAC sanctions and regulations, which basically resulted in all banks, insurers, and reinsurers inserting all kinds of really complicated clauses in order to secure their interests. And I think this is not the time and place to have a look into those clauses, but I think you can imagine what they look like. The problem is, of course, they're very, very wide normally in formulation, and then if you violate against them, then you end up without any financing or any backup of your investment. So first of all, you have to do your due diligence, and then you have to secure an acquisition agreements that the parties that are involved in this kind of deal are not subject to sanctions themselves. These are just two examples that I brought here today as, first of all, an example for a provision intended to identify the sanction status of the parties, which is quite simple. We can basically skip through that easily, of course, none of the parties is subject to a sanction. And then another one, provision intended to obtain assurance that no investigations are in process. This should also be part of your agreement. Now let's get into a couple of practical implications that also we as an international transport company are facing every time we're thinking about an investment in Eastern Europe. So, for example, if an acquisition of 20% of the shares in a Russian port operations company is planned, then just one example is that, of course, you have the banks, but you also have an investment guarantor for a federal guarantee to cover, and they're asking, of course, also for an undertaking and for a declaration of your company to be sure that that you're not violating any sanctions. And this can look kind of like this, and you run into some interesting legal questions that we come to in a bit. So we assure that we observe the current applicable foreign trade and sanctions law, particularly the following rules, in connection with a defined matter to be covered by this guarantee. And then, of course, it's a list of all kinds of sanctions, which I have abbreviated here. Now, the big legal assessment that you're facing at that time is the scope of the assurance. What is it relating to? Is it relating to the investment only, which means basically buying shares in a foreign company, or is it actually including the operation of the business of the target company, which might possibly be handling sanctioned goods in the future or even now? It's something that you have to ask yourself, of course, how far this assurance is going. I guess you have to make sure that the cover note itself only explicitly relates to the acquisition of the shares, and if it does, then the future operational business of a target company is probably likely not to fall under the assurance. But of course, if the scope is larger, then you need to have a look into the operational business of the company. You need to check once again if the business and even possibly future business might violate the sanctions. Another thing, of course, in this case is we were talking about a 20% share here, is that if you're only acquiring 20% of shares in a company, then normally, of course, you don't get any control over the company, and you're not able to influence the decisions and and especially the operative business of the target company. This is also a good indication that that might lead you to the conclusion that here you're rather safe to give such an assurance. It would be different, of course, if you buy 20%, 50% or more of the shares. Yeah, that's basically the conclusion here. Now, another thing, of course, maybe one last thing here. This is one thing I mentioned, is that if you've covered all your own homework and you've done all your business partner screening and so on, and you're close to actually making an investment, then you might still end up, of course, that your local partner is, and I think we heard earlier that, of course, some of the banks, Russian banks, for example, have been part of sanctions, that they all of a sudden have no longer financing, and then at the very last minute, sometimes your deal might blow up because this the sanction hit your partner, not you, but your partner, and then, of course, you're back into the position that there's not much you can do about. Okay, the second example is just to show you that it's not always all these. If you meet all the expectations from the authorities and from the sanctions regulations. For example, if you're planning a service agreement with an Iranian company, you've done all your homework, the company is not on the sanction list, goods and services are not sanctioned, the people involved are not sanctioned, appropriate sanctions clauses are even negotiated, which, by the way, is also sometimes quite difficult, especially when you talk to your high-level management. I even learned at one time we were in negotiations, and then I said, well, we need to list in the force majeure clause that we need to list certain events and certain people that they are not subject to sanctions. And then our management said, but that's impolite. You cannot do that. It's an insult actually to bring them into connection even with sanctions. So even this is a kind of a topic that you also have to consider sometimes. It's not only just the mere regulations themselves, but sometimes it's actually just pure politics. So yeah, legally in this case you would have a green light here, but nevertheless don't underestimate here the influence of the relation to your own government in this respect. If you're a large company, of course, you have relations to your government, and if they become aware that you are planning to invest in a risk country, for example, it doesn't matter whether you've done all your homework and everything is perfectly fine legally. You might still end up with so much pressure that you cannot do the investment in the end. And of course, you also have to think about your own good reputation. If you're considering this. Yes, so I think, yeah, we should.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
We should finish. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions.